Okay, I am back. I'm going to try and pick the speed up a little bit because I feel like I was taking a little bit too long. So, what we left off on was everything that Aristotle said, and then what just innately kind of disproves what he said, which is that the brain is just naturally wired to acquire languages. Language universals are innate. So therefore, there's sort of a little bit of reasoning as to why ASL popped up, as to why it's necessary, as to why it can be picked up. Because if people who are deaf were, like Aristotle says, unable to be taught, then it would make no sense that their ASL exists and that there's so many different variations of it throughout the world. So anyways, let's keep going. Let's touch briefly on the history of ASL. ASL got to start in France from Michael de Lepay, a priest that transcribed the alphabet into various gestures and then created a public school for the deaf that was completely free of charge. Then eventually British American Sign Language, Black ASL begins to be taught at certain schools that were not allowing Black students to study because of segregation. And these are a little, I think these are mixed up. So the third bubble should be on the top before the BASL. So in the 1800s, Thomas Hopkins creates ASL, and it's sort of it's an extension, or it's sort of a branch of the French version of ASL. And then because of segregation, BASL begins to be taught at certain schools. And then there's a photo up here. Hopefully you guys can see that shows a school that I believe was called a school for the colored, blind, and deaf, or something like that. And that's typically where BASL was taught, because they were not allowed to go to white schools where regular ASL was being taught. So from here, BSL, which is British Sign Language, and then Australian ASLAN come into existence. Let's continue. I'm going to touch on some of the debates or some of the things that the community isn't fully in agreement of, or that have damaged it, unfortunately. There is the oralism versus manualism debate, which essentially, if you just heard the name, what I said, just points out that some people were advocating for there to be, there's the description right there, the theory, practice, or advocacy of education for the deaf, briefly or exclusively through lip reading, training in speech production, and training of residual hearing, which obviously, given that there's all of these different types of ASL and all of these different communities, a lot of people who are deaf will find that very sad, that oralism is still being pushed mostly. And then therefore, many people will advocate for its counterpart, which is manualism, the theory, practice, or practice of education for the deaf, employing and promoting the use of sign language as a primary means of communication. Then there is one hand versus two hand. That's not necessarily any debate or anything, but there is some certain sign languages that require one hand or two hands, or there's certain signs that require you to sign with one hand or two hands, though there are variations of ASL, like we're going to talk about Black ASL, that are typically signed with both hands, and we're going to talk about sort of the reasonings behind that. Here's a quick TED Talk video. Hopefully it plays.
Cuando no dejas de retarte, ni el cielo es el límite. Honda.
Piano, P, is my favorite musical symbol. It means to play softly. If you're playing a musical instrument and you notice a P in the score, you need to play softer. 2 Ps, even softer. 4 Ps, extremely soft. This is my drawing of a pea tree, which demonstrates no matter how many thousands upon thousands of peas there may be, you'll never reach complete silence. That's my current definition of silence, a very obscure sound. I'd like to share a little bit about the history of American Sign Language, ASL, plus a bit of my own background. French Sign Language was brought to America during the early 1800s, and as time went by, mixed with local signs, it evolved into the language we know today as ASL. So it has a history of about 200 years. I was born deaf, and I was taught to believe that sound wasn't a part of my life. And I believed it to be true. Yet, I realize now that that wasn't the case at all. Sound was very much a part of my life, really on my mind every day. As a deaf person living in a world of sound, it's as if I was living in a foreign country, blindly following its rules, customs, behaviors, and norms without ever questioning them. So how is it that I understand sound? Well, I watch how people behave and respond to sound. You people are like my loudspeakers and amplify sound.
So that is a great video if you want to take a look at it. It is a little long, so I'm not going to play I'm not going to play it in its entirety. But it is a great video, and she basically talks about how she showed the pea tree. She does different artworks utilizing the way that she interprets sound. Okay. So let's get into some of the studies that back up the claims that I'm making. Study number 1 is regarding neural correlates. So essentially the participants were 10 subjects, 5 of them are male. From these, a hearing and a hearing non-signing group and a deaf group were split off. And then the subjects viewed videos and then they were told through there what signs they had to do. The findings were that self-oriented actions cause blood flow to the brain. The interesting thing, though, is that the deaf subjects were more sensitive to the type of action that was being performed or that was asked of them to perform. And they were able to very quickly know what was a word in their specific sign language versus what was simply just a movement of the hand. So seemingly their brain is able to just pick up those signals a lot easier and make that distinction. Study number 2 is regarding eye tracking. The participants were all San Diego community residents. 61 of the participants were included in the eye tracker part of the study. There were a few more participants, but they had to drop them due to them not signing the necessary waivers and stuff. So the methodology: gaze data allowed researchers to take notes of where babies were looking while signing was happening in front of them. And it wasn't always babies, it was sometimes toddlers, but that's how they were described in the study. The findings were that the gaze patterns of a baby that had been primed to look out for ASL, or that had been primed with ASL since it was born, were very similar to an adult native signer that was attempting to understand what was being said to them. And that was very different from the control group that was just babies that are spoken to in regular English and then that were, being signed to. They don't recognize that as any form of speech. So therefore their gaze pattern is completely different compared to infants that are actively recognizing that that is speech and that they are being talked to or signed at. Study number 3, sign production and finger spelling. The participants were 11 right-handed deaf signers between 21 and 35 years of age. They all had experience with ASL, and that was their preferred language. The methodology was that the participants were shown an English word on the computer, and then they were told to sign it. The words were diverse, and some had to be finger spelled, while others did not, so they had to be fully spelled, either one hand or two hand. The findings were that it was very rare for the participants to fail or miss a word. They did show greater activation for one-handed signs in some regions of the brain, which they mentioned that should be looked into further. And then lastly, one of the sections that lit up more was the left inferior frontal gyrus and the left superior parietal lobule and the right cerebellum. So a lot of areas that are typically known to be sort of powerhouses behind language and language learning. Study number 4 has to do with executive functioning, and this is sort of to disprove the notion that children who are not born with, or that aren't taught a spoken language, have worse executive functioning. So the participants were 16 children between the ages of 5 and 12. The kids were put into groups, hearing, deaf native signers who are congenitally deaf, and then cochlear implant users. The methodology was to have different methods of testing and to sort of give them out in different situations. So be it small quizzes at home or at school or just personal interactions, little questions with the kids. But ultimately the findings were that audition and a spoken language is not needed to have a healthy executive functioning. Language development is the most important thing of all. So as long as you have a language, that's perfectly fine. It doesn't matter if it's spoken or signed or anything like that. Alrighty. Study number 5 has to do with fMRI scanning. So this is when we start getting a lot more technical and sort of able to show a lot of the images and things like that. So here the participants are 8 men and 6 women. The mean age was 22 and a half years old. The methodology was that the participants would be inside of an MRI machine and they would be shown a specific sign, and they had a button inside of the machine that they were able to click whenever they were able to recognize a sign that was in a specific semantic category. So if they're like, this thing was asking them for a sign in the woman category and they were, or food or shelter or whatever, they were able to click it. And the findings were the previously thought notion that all language depends on certain areas of the brain was ultimately backed up. And this was all through ASL. So therefore, even the brain recognizes that that is a real language. Though in native signers, regions of face perception and biological motion take role of linguistic processing, which is very interesting. So if for people that were taught sign from a very early age, as in like their first language most likely, their regions of the face were also, the regions of face perception as well as biological motion also are sort of melded with that linguistic processing. Study number 6 is the fMRI and TMS. This was including 33 hearing females and 21 deaf females. They did not explain why they used only women, but that was the case. So using an fMRI and TMS, they scanned and took images of the brain to determine how sign language was being processed in the brain and in different areas specifically. So the findings were that the superior parietal lobule participates a lot in signing, but it might be different depending on the hemisphere. The conclusion was that the right side is responsible for attention, while the left side is in charge of identifying and integrating. So again, there's this sort of working together of both lobules in order to sort of process and be able to say things back with an ASL. So very much like real language, it's you're not just using like one section of your brain. Different types of sign language. We are officially done with the studies, and now we are getting into sort of the more fun stuff. International sign language is super interesting because this is what they would use at Congress. They use this at the Deaf Olympics. They use this at the World Federation of the Deaf, and it is essentially not as conventional